Late last night, news emerging from Switzerland detonated like a financial earthquake inside Donald Trump's inner circle. According to multiple sources familiar with the matter, Swiss financial regulators have moved to freeze what they describe as substantial assets connected to Trump, locking down an estimated $6 billion across several accounts. The money is now inaccessible, frozen under strict compliance procedures, and the timing could not be worse. While Trump is publicly focused on campaigning and fighting legal battles in the United States, behind the scenes his financial world is facing a crisis that may be far more damaging than anything he's dealt with before. This is not some routine banking dispute or paperwork delay. Swiss authorities are known for their extreme caution and discretion, and they do not freeze accounts of this magnitude without serious cause. Their banking system is built on stability and trust, and any intervention at this level signals deep concerns. What's unfolding is the result of a growing international investigation that began when Swiss compliance teams flagged a series of transactions that did not align with standard anti-money laundering frameworks. Those flags triggered a cascade of reviews, drawing in international regulators and eventually the attention of the U.S. Treasury. For Trump, the stakes could not be higher. For nearly a decade, he has carefully cultivated the image of a self-made billionaire, repeatedly claiming a net worth that fluctuated between $10 and $15 billion. He presented himself as a president who could not be bought, a man whose wealth placed him beyond the reach of influence. That image has been central to his political brand since 2015. But now, as investigators dig into transactions dating back to his first presidential campaign, that carefully constructed narrative is under real pressure. Sources say the investigation has already been active for more than a month, with Swiss regulators demanding full documentation for the origins and movement of funds going back to 2016. Trump's legal team has reportedly attempted to block disclosure by invoking various privileges and challenging Swiss jurisdiction. That strategy has backfired. Faced with resistance and a refusal to cooperate, Swiss authorities chose the nuclear option, freezing the accounts entirely until compliance requirements are met. Trump did not take the news quietly. Within hours, his lawyers were labeling the move unlawful and politically motivated, accusing Switzerland of interfering in American elections. Trump himself took to social media, blasting what he called a foreign witch hunt and framing the freeze as yet another coordinated attack against him. The rhetoric was familiar, but this time the audience wasn't just his base. Major donors, party officials, and financial backers were watching closely, and many were alarmed. The concern isn't only about frozen money, it's about what frozen money implies. If Swiss regulators are willing to immobilize billions, it raises uncomfortable questions about how those funds were structured and whether all financial disclosures have been truthful. Campaign insiders quietly admit that cash flow has become an issue. Legal expenses continue to climb. International obligations don't pause, and frozen assets don't pay bills. Trump's history with financial scrutiny offers a preview of what usually comes next. When former allies or institutions begin cooperating with investigators, Trump tends to turn on them swiftly and publicly. Longtime confidants, lawyers, executives, and banks have all found themselves recast as enemies the moment they stop protecting his interests. Observers note that the same pattern appears to be repeating now, this time with an entire national banking system in the crosshairs. As the freeze stretches into its second month, pressure is building from all sides. Some Republicans are urging cooperation to resolve the issue quietly. Others fear that any compliance will reveal more than Trump is willing to disclose. Meanwhile, Trump remains trapped between two instincts: his need to access the money and his refusal to acknowledge any authority over his finances. And looming over all of it is a sense that this story is only beginning. In the background, something else is stirring, something no one in Trump's camp expected, and when it surfaces publicly, it will shift this entire scandal into a completely new dimension. What truly escalated the situation was not another court filing or an angry post online, but a voice that had remained conspicuously silent for years. As the Swiss freeze dominated quiet conversations in boardrooms and donor circles, Warren Buffett unexpectedly entered the picture. Through a brief but carefully worded statement released by Berkshire Hathaway, Buffett did something almost unheard of for him. He addressed Trump indirectly, and the implications landed like a thunderclap. Buffett has historically avoided direct political confrontations, especially with Trump. His silence during Trump's presidency was often interpreted as strategic restraint. That's why his sudden reappearance in this story set off alarms across Wall Street and Washington alike. According to reporting that quickly spread through financial media, Buffett remarked that financial behavior, not public bravado, is what ultimately reveals character. He added that Swiss regulators are not impulsive actors and do not immobilize assets without compelling reasons. The message was unmistakable. Coming from one of the most respected investors in the world, it sounded less like commentary and more like a warning. But Buffett didn't stop there. He revealed that his firm had been approached years earlier, around 2016, regarding certain financial opportunities linked to transactions that failed to meet Berkshire Hathaway's standards for transparency. Buffett stated plainly that his company declined involvement and walked away. Others, he implied, did not. That single remark sent shockwaves through donor networks and compliance departments. If Buffett had seen enough red flags to step aside nearly a decade ago, what exactly had he been shown, and who had gone forward anyway? For Trump, the timing could not have been worse. The Swiss freeze had already raised doubts, but Buffett's statement reframed the narrative. This was no longer just about regulators versus a political figure. It was now about whether respected financial institutions had long been aware of questionable practices and chosen not to engage. Suddenly, the story had history. It suggested that the current crisis might not be an isolated incident, but the delayed consequence of decisions made years earlier. Inside Republican circles, anxiety began to spread. Major donors started asking quiet questions. Some wondered whether their own past interactions or contributions could come under scrutiny if the investigation widened. Others worried about the political cost of standing too close to Trump as the story evolved. The party's leadership found itself in an uncomfortable position, torn between loyalty to its most powerful figure and the growing perception of financial instability. Trump responded in the way he usually does when cornered. He doubled down. He attacked the Swiss banking system as corrupt and politically motivated, calling for economic retaliation and even floating the idea of pulling the United States out of certain international financial agreements. He urged supporters to boycott Swiss products and framed the freeze as proof that global elites were conspiring against him. For his core base, the rhetoric resonated. For institutional Republicans and financial backers, it sounded reckless. Behind closed doors, some GOP lawmakers reportedly urged Trump to cooperate quietly and resolve the issue before it spiraled further. Those suggestions were not well received. Any call for compliance was branded as weakness. Anyone advocating transparency risked being labeled disloyal. The result was paralysis, no resolution, no access to frozen funds, and mounting pressure. As the weeks passed, polling began to reflect growing public discomfort. While Trump's most devoted supporters remained unmoved, independent voters and moderate Republicans expressed concern about a presidential candidate whose assets were frozen by one of the world's most conservative banking systems. The symbolism mattered. Switzerland is not known for dramatic gestures. If it was acting, many reasoned, something serious must be at stake. And just as the political temperature rose, another crack appeared. A prominent Republican senator, long cautious but rarely outspoken, publicly broke ranks. He questioned Trump's strategy, arguing that dismissing Swiss regulators as partisan actors ignored the gravity of the situation. When billions are frozen by a system built on restraint, he said, that is not persecution, it is a problem. That comment signaled a shift. The wall of silence inside the party was beginning to fracture, and as it did, the investigation itself was accelerating. International cooperation mechanisms were being activated. Financial records were being requested across borders. The freeze, once seen as temporary leverage, now looked like the opening move in something far larger. What started as a banking action was rapidly transforming into a test of accountability, power, and precedent. and the next steps would determine whether this story ended quietly or exploded into the most consequential financial scandal of a generation. The moment the U.S. Treasury formally stepped into the situation, the stakes shifted from uncomfortable to historic. In a carefully measured statement, the Treasury Secretary confirmed that American authorities would fully cooperate with Swiss regulators, emphasizing that international financial agreements apply to everyone, including former presidents. The language was diplomatic, but the message was unmistakable. This was no longer a foreign dispute Trump could dismiss or delay. The machinery of international compliance had been engaged, and once activated, it rarely stopped halfway. Almost immediately, the cooperation began to expose layers that had previously remained sealed. Sources familiar with the process described an urgent exchange of information between U.S. and Swiss financial authorities, focusing on transaction flows, account structures, and the movement of funds tied to both personal and political operations. Each passing day that the accounts remained frozen raised new questions about liquidity, solvency, and whether Trump's financial operations were as independent and robust as he had long claimed. Major media outlets seized on the development. Investigative reporting revealed that the frozen Swiss accounts were not limited to personal holdings. Some of the funds, according to preliminary findings, were earmarked for political activities and operational expenses tied to Trump's broader organization. That revelation carried serious legal implications. The commingling of personal and political funds is a red line in campaign finance law, and even the suggestion of it invited intense scrutiny. Legal analysts from across the political spectrum began weighing in. Former prosecutors noted that this level of international coordination was highly unusual, particularly involving a former head of state. Conservative legal commentators, normally quick to defend Trump, acknowledged that Swiss regulators would need substantial evidence to justify immobilizing billions of dollars. When even sympathetic voices conceded the severity of the situation, the narrative began to shift decisively. Trump's response followed a familiar script, but with increasing intensity. He dismissed the findings as fabricated, accused regulators of acting as political operatives, and portrayed himself as the victim of a coordinated global assault. Yet behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. Campaign staff reportedly faced growing difficulties securing funding. Legal costs continued to rise. Business partners grew cautious, uncertain whether their own dealings might be pulled into the investigation. The financial strain was becoming harder to hide. Trump's public image relied on strength and dominance, but frozen assets undermined both. Wealth, after all, is only power if it can be used. Locked behind regulatory walls, billions become symbols of vulnerability rather than influence. Allies began to worry that Trump's strategy of total defiance was not only failing, but actively worsening the situation. International observers were paying close attention. Swiss banks, keenly aware of their global reputation, framed the freeze as a matter of legal obligation, not politics. Ignoring potential violations would have damaged their credibility far more than weathering Trump's attacks. In doing so, they placed themselves at the center of an American political storm, but also reinforced a principle that underpins global finance. No individual, regardless of power or status, is exempt from oversight. As the investigation widened, experts warned that Swiss cooperation could open pathways into financial networks that had never been fully mapped. Transactions rarely exist in isolation. They leave trails, connections, and counterparts. Once regulators begin following those trails across borders, entire structures can come into view. The possibility that this case could expose a much larger web of financial relationships began to loom. Within the Republican Party, the strain was undeniable. Some leaders urged unity and patience, while others quietly distanced themselves, fearing political fallout. The idea that a presidential candidate might be entangled in a massive international banking investigation unsettled donors and strategists alike. Stability, not chaos, wins elections, and this story was anything but stable. As weeks passed, the question shifted from whether Trump could resolve the freeze to whether he was willing to pay the price required to do so. Cooperation could unlock the funds, but risk revealing information he had long kept out of reach. Continued resistance preserved his narrative of defiance, but deepened suspicion and financial paralysis. This was the trap Trump had built for himself, and with each new disclosure, it became clearer that the consequences would not be confined to Switzerland or even to this election cycle. The precedent being set would ripple through global finance and American politics alike long after the immediate crisis had passed. As the investigation pushed forward, its implications began to stretch far beyond Trump himself, touching the foundations of how international finance and democratic accountability intersect. What initially looked like a foreign banking dispute had evolved into a referendum on whether wealth and political power could override global rules. Legal scholars pointed out that the last time a figure with Trump's profile faced this level of foreign financial restriction, there was no modern comparison. This was uncharted territory, and everyone involved knew it. Inside the Democratic Party, strategists quickly recognized the opportunity. They framed the Swiss freeze not as an isolated scandal, but as evidence of a broader pattern, a leader who consistently treated laws, norms, and institutions as optional obstacles rather than binding rules. Campaign messaging began to crystallize around the idea of restoring credibility and stability to America's relationship with international financial systems. The contrast was deliberate and sharp. On one side, chaos, secrecy, and confrontation. On the other, transparency and cooperation. Republicans, meanwhile, found themselves split. Some doubled down on defending Trump, echoing his claims that the investigation was politically motivated and part of a global effort to undermine him. Others grew increasingly uneasy. Privately, they worried about the electoral consequences of defending someone whose assets were frozen abroad. Public trust, they knew, is fragile. Voters may tolerate controversy, but sustained financial uncertainty tied to foreign regulators was another matter entirely. The pressure intensified as experts explained what could come next. Swiss authorities were not simply holding money as leverage, they were preserving evidence. Every transaction linked to the frozen accounts was being scrutinized, cross-referenced, and mapped. Once those records were shared with international partners, they could expose connections that had never been visible before. Former prosecutors emphasized that financial investigations often expand quietly, revealing more as regulators follow the money outward rather than inward. Trump's refusal to cooperate fully only heightened suspicion. In the world of compliance, silence and obstruction are rarely neutral acts. They are interpreted as signals. Each legal challenge, each public attack on regulators reinforced the perception that there was something more to uncover. Even some longtime supporters began to question whether the strategy of constant confrontation was sustainable. At the same time, the broader financial community was watching closely. Banks, investment firms, and multinational institutions depend on predictable rules and mutual enforcement. If a former U.S. president could simply ignore international banking standards without consequence, it would destabilize the entire system. The Swiss freeze, controversial as it was, became a test case for whether global financial oversight still had teeth. The political consequences were already rippling outward. Allies hesitated before appearing alongside Trump. Donors delayed commitments. Advisors struggled to reassure nervous stakeholders. And all the while, the frozen billions remained untouched, a silent reminder that defiance does not move money. As election season drew closer, the narrative hardened. Trump was no longer just a polarizing candidate. He was a symbol of unresolved risk. Every unanswered question about his finances became ammunition for critics and a liability for those standing beside him. The longer the freeze persisted, the harder it became to argue that this was a temporary inconvenience rather than a fundamental challenge to his credibility. By now, it was clear that the outcome would shape more than a single campaign. It would influence how future leaders handled their finances, how aggressively regulators enforced cross-border rules, and whether transparency remained a cornerstone of democratic governance. The system was being tested, and the world was watching to see whether it would bend or hold. And with new disclosures rumored to be imminent, the final phase of this saga was approaching fast, a moment that would determine whether this crisis ended as a cautionary tale or as a turning point with consequences lasting decades. As the situation enters its most decisive phase, the consequences are becoming impossible to contain. What began as a regulatory action by Swiss authorities has grown into a defining test of whether financial power can still be held accountable in a globalized world. With each passing day, the frozen billions serve as more than just immobilized assets. They stand as a challenge to a political culture that has long blurred the line between personal wealth and public power. Behind closed doors, the central question is no longer whether Trump can outlast the investigation, but whether he can survive what comes next. If he continues to resist Swiss regulators, the freeze may become permanent, triggering further scrutiny and potentially opening additional cases in other jurisdictions. If he cooperates, the documentation required could expose transactions and relationships he has spent years keeping out of view. Either path carries risk, and neither offers a clean escape. Financial experts warn that the real danger lies in what has not yet been made public. Money rarely moves alone. Every transfer implies a sender, a recipient, an intermediary. Once investigators begin assembling that web, they can uncover patterns that extend far beyond the original accounts. What is now framed as a $6 billion freeze could evolve into a much broader reckoning involving banks, partners, and political entities across borders. Politically, the damage is already taking shape. Trump enters the election cycle burdened by a narrative of instability, secrecy, and confrontation with international institutions. For voters exhausted by years of turmoil, this story reinforces doubts about whether he represents strength or chaos. Opponents are seizing on the symbolism, a candidate whose wealth is locked away by foreign regulators, unable or unwilling to explain its origins. The implications reach deeper than one campaign. If Trump manages to evade meaningful consequences, it could signal to future elites that international financial rules are negotiable for those powerful enough to resist. That precedent would weaken the entire architecture of global oversight. On the other hand, if regulators hold firm and transparency prevails, it would reaffirm a basic democratic principle: that no individual, regardless of status, stands above the systems designed to protect integrity and trust. This is why the case resonates far beyond Switzerland or the United States. It speaks to the future of financial accountability in an era of extreme wealth and political polarization. It asks whether institutions still matter, or whether they can be bent by those willing to attack them loudly enough and long enough. As new revelations loom and cooperation between regulators deepens, the window for quiet resolution is closing. The coming weeks will determine not just the fate of frozen accounts, but the message sent to the world about power, money, and the rule of law. Whether this story ends in disclosure or defiance, its impact will echo long after the headlines fade. What happens next will define far more than one man's legacy. It will define how seriously we still take the idea that transparency is the price of power, and whether that price is one even the most powerful are still expected to pay.